Hello, everybody. My name's Ali Boyle. I'm Keeper of Collections at the Science Museum, and I'd like to take the very appropriately scientific occasion of the equinox to welcome you to tonight's very special event held in partnership with the Royal Society. We're celebrating Science City, 1550 to 1800, the Linbury Gallery, which opened at the Science Museum in London in 2019. And obviously we've been closed for some of that time, so it hasn't been possible to visit, but we are back open again, and we do hope to see you in this gallery with its collection of unique and rare items. Those include such treasures as Robert Hooke's Micrographia and Isaac Newton's Principia, and the gallery looks at how London played a role in the creation of what came to be known as a new type of science through experiments and instruments, observations, record keeping and publishing. Changing the way we described and understood the world around us. In his wonderful book, The Age of Genius, the 17th Century and the Birth of the Modern Mind, Professor A.C. Grayling argues that the period that we cover in the gallery, in particular the 17th century, birthed the greatest ever change in the mental outlook of humanity, not only transforming the scientific landscape, but giving rise to the modern European mind as we know it today. So we're first going to hear a short talk from Professor Grayling. And after that, he's going to have an in-depth conversation with Cambridge University historian and author of Life After Gravity, Isaac Newton's London Career, Dr. Patricia Fara. Dr. Fara is also going to put to Professor Grayling some of the questions that have been sent in by you, the audience. So without further ado, it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Professor A.C. Grayling. He's the founder and principal of the New College of the Humanities at Northeastern University, where he is Professor of Philosophy. He's the author of more than 30 books on philosophy, biography, history of ideas, and essays, including, of course, the book that we'll be discussing this evening. So, Professor Grayling, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Boyle. Great pleasure to be here. And I want to begin by thanking Dr. Fara, Patricia Fara, for joining us this evening. And I very much look forward to the chat with her. Well, as you gathered from what Dr. Boyle said there, I make a very big claim about the 17th century. I say it is a major dog's leg in the history of human thought, indeed of the human mind, and of our thinking about the universe that we occupy. And in order to illustrate this, and one can do it really quite easily, one has only to imagine what an educated person saw if he or she stepped out on a clear night and looked up at the stars in the year 1600. Well, that person would have seen the great majestic panoply of the heavens rotating around the earth, with the earth at the center of the universe, and all this creation having been organized really as a theater in which human destiny would unfold. By the year 1700, when people stepped out at night and looked up at the stars, they saw something radically different. Exactly the same irradiation of their retinas occurred, but they didn't see a universe rotating around them. They saw immeasurable depths of space. They saw bodies so far distant that it was almost unimaginable, or almost certainly vertiginous, even to think about it. That is one huge shift in the perspective that we humans have had on the universe. And at the beginning of the 17th century, in the first 3 decades and a little bit more, if we think about the trial of Galileo in the early 1630s, it was in those parts of Europe that were still under the control of the Catholic Church, it was still dangerous to assert that the Copernican view that the sun was at the center, that the earth was not at the center at any rate, it's still dangerous to assert that and to teach that in formal settings. By the last couple of decades of the 17th century, it had become commonplace to see that this new way of looking at the universe, this but dramatically different way of looking at the universe, was acceptable. People could publish it, and indeed many books and essays with that as its theme were indeed published. Also, we see a tremendous shift in the way that people thought about society and thought about authority in the state, from the divine right of kings in the early part of the 17th century to a parliamentary revolution, at least here in England, that part of the British Isles, in the glorious revolution of 1688. That is a tremendous change as well. Only think about it. I cite the example of Macbeth, the play, which was premiered in London in 1606, in the Palace of Whitehall. And one of the premises of that play is that to kill a king, so the murder of King Duncan, was a form of sacrilege, because the king ruled by divine right, and it was a blasphemy to murder the anointed of God, and that if that happened, the horses would eat one another in the stables, and the owl would attack the falcon instead of the other way around, and the order of nature would be upset. That was 1606. But in 1649, just one generation later, 43 years later, King Charles I had his head chopped off in the very same place in Whitehall where Macbeth had first been staged. Some great shift of perspective, a different way of thinking about society was in progress. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the century is that at the beginning of the century, those people who were engaged in making efforts to try to understand how nature works in order to exert some control over it, and the majority of those who were doing that at that time were people who were interested in alchemy and in magic, and in the Kabbalah, Hermeticism, those sorts of movements which had been released in the 16th century by the Reformation. Point, I'll come back to it in a moment because it's a very important point. And they were keeping their secrets to themselves. I mean, if I could find out how to change base metals into gold, I'm not going to tell anybody else because I wouldn't want the price of gold to drop, and I certainly wouldn't want to lose the advantage of having that secret. But by the later part of the century, so during the second half of that century, we see all over Europe, but also most particularly, of course, in London with the setting up of the Royal Society itself, one of the sponsors of this evening's event, we see the coming together of savants, of researchers, people thinking, working, researching, coming up with ideas, conducting experiments. And this is something which at the beginning of the 17th century had been very, very strongly urged by Francis Bacon, who argued that science ought to be a communal endeavor. The people should work together and share their ideas, check one another's findings, and that by this means, in what he described in his writings on the matter as a Solomon's house, a house of wisdom, that's what the Royal Society became, that the progress of science would be much enhanced by that means. His contemporary, René Descartes, was also a very significant figure as well in arguing about method, because at that time, the distinction drawn between what we think of as chemistry and as medicine and as astronomy, the distinction between those things and, say, alchemy and magic and astrology just weren't clear. And so it was of the first importance that methodological ideas should be explored and asserted in order to try to separate out those sorts of inquiries that might lead to genuine results and those that might just lead to yet more nonsense. And so a great endeavor of achieving method in philosophy, method in the natural sciences as they became, and even indeed method in thinking about society, about politics, and bringing into all our attempts to understand the world around us, the scientific method which was developed during the 17th century, of course, had its great flowering in the Enlightenment of the 18th century. When you look at what the encyclopedists, Diderot, d'Alembert, and the others were doing in the 18th century, they were applying the new empirical scientific mood across the entire board of researches and inquiries in the social sciences, in history, much, much more broadly than just science itself. So it seems to me that if you contrast how things were, essentially, the mindset of humanity in the year 1600 was continuous with how it had been for many, many, many centuries before. It was a mindset in which religious commitments, in which a geocentric view of the universe, in which a sense that the whole theater of the universe was really about humankind, who were not just simply at the center of the universe, but also at the very summit of the natural creation, at any rate. That view was abandoned during the course of the 17th century by these great changes in the way that people thought and researched and came to understand the world around them. And that is why I make this big claim about the 17th century being very special. Now, I've mentioned the change of view about method and the empowerment that was given to thought by the release of new techniques of inquiry. There were also, of course, very, very other important aspects of it, like the development of instruments. The microscope, the telescope were both very important in the 17th century. The advent of well-calibrated weights and measures, the use of new mathematical techniques and their development, all these were very important. But one key thing that one must remember here is the Reformation of the 16th century. What happened with that was that the power of the church over thought, what it was permissible to think, the demand that all inquiry should be consistent with, should support, and should definitely not controvert the teachings of doctrine, that hold over the mind of Europe, as it was broken by the Reformation. And in those parts of Europe that became Protestant, Lutheran to begin with, and then also other parts Calvinist, even if Lutherans and Calvinists and the followers of Zwingli shared the same kind of anxieties that the Catholic Church has now become, having just been the church beforehand, even if they had the same kinds of anxieties about the impugning of scripture by these new advances in thought, nevertheless, they didn't have the power to do anything about it. The Church of Rome did have power, kept that power, tried to exert it right up into the third decade of the 17th century, but effectively, that was its last throw of the dice on that matter. And later in the century and subsequently, of course, the Church was not in a position to stop the advance of thinking. And one final point before we go to conversation, and that is that it's often forgotten that the 17th century was a century of the most awful turmoil in Europe. There was a devastating series of wars, the greatest, the most destructive, the most murderous of which was the 30 Years' War that began technically in 1618 and finished with the treaties of Westphalia in 1648. Although in fact, in the entire century, there were only 2 years 69 to 71, when there wasn't actual fighting going on somewhere on the continent of Europe. And therefore, it is all the more extraordinary to think that a century which contained Cervantes and Shakespeare and Milton in literature, had Descartes and Hobbes and Grotius and Spinoza in philosophy, which had Galileo and Boyle, Newton, I mean, just litanies of names in all these great fields of endeavor. How is it that a century could produce so many what we now in our modern parlance think of as geniuses, great contributors to the development of thought, of science, of the arts and the humanities? How is it that a century could produce so many such great minds and great contributors against the background of this most awful turmoil? Well, alas, times of turmoil, times which are very destructive, have aspects to them where opportunities for advance and progress can happen. And also times of emergency and danger tend to speed things up. History gets faster during those times. And I give the example there of how in 1939, so this is just an analogy, in 1939, the Royal Air Force in this country was still flying Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, and the Fleet Air Arm still had Swordfish biplanes. And 6 years later, 1945, the Royal Air Force was already making use of the Whittle jet fighter. Already missiles, the V1, the V2 rockets were being fired. Already atom bombs were being used. So if you think about the rate of change in technology and the implementation of discoveries in science in a mere 6 years, prompted by the urgency of war, you can take that back into the 17th century and see all the devastations of the military conflicts of that period as being great potentiators of advances, not just, by the way, in military technology and engineering, but in all their spin-offs and in organization required for raising armies, funding them, providing them. But in the obverse of that as well, which is that border controls broke down. People traveling with the armies or across borders which were not as tightly policed as before, communicating with one another in a situation where censorship was more difficult, meant that ideas could circulate in Europe more freely as a result of the breakdown of order and the turmoil. And so one puts together a number of different factors and sees why it is that the world as it was viewed from the person looking at the night sky in the year 1700 was so utterly different from the world looked at in the year 1600. And when you look at other centuries in history, look at our own recent 100 years or so, the 20th century in particular, that has been a century of very, very spectacular advance. You look at the great period in classical antiquity, especially the period between the 6th and the 4th centuries before the Common Era, that was an era of great advance too. But neither of those two eras, even our most recent one, the 20th century and 21st century one with the great developments in science, even those areas haven't shifted our view, haven't changed the way we see the universe. It's not as though we see the universe, we see more of the universe and more deeply into it now, but it's not as though we have stopped seeing it as this vast arena of galaxies and networks of galaxies, 13.72 billion years old, as though suddenly we had reverted to seeing it as geocentric or in some utterly different way, as it happened in the 17th century. There, the change of viewpoint, the change of vision was dramatic. And that is why I cite the 17th century as being the moment really in the history of humankind where this great change took place.
Well, Anthony, thank you very much indeed for that very enticing overview of your book. And I hope that the conversation we're about to have will give you an opportunity to explain in more depth some of the points that you've already raised. And we've had several questions in advance from the audience. So I'd like to start with one of those audience questions. It's from Simon Flynn, and he asks, given the title of your talk and of your book, what is your definition of genius? You mentioned geniuses just now, but perhaps you'd like to just amplify a bit exactly what you mean by genius.
Well, I mean, it's a very, very good question, this, because it is a word that does get bandied around a little bit more. And I know, Patricia, that you yourself have had something to say about that.
Indeed, it's a question close to my heart.
Indeed, indeed. Well, my own view is that it's a label that we stick onto people whose contributions are in a positive sense of egregious, so that they stand out and they make a very big difference. They lodge in our minds because they're emblematic in a very significant way for us of something that we value now. So we think of people like Einstein and Darwin and others, but almost certainly the case, that Darwin is an example of the genius which results from paying a great deal of careful attention to things, the 99% perspiration version of genius rather than the great inspirational poetic version of genius. We think of Newton as a genius, and we make him stand out and perhaps see him incorrectly because, again, another thing that you've written about Newton more than once, and people see him as the originator of hard science, and they forget, of course, that he was also tremendously into alchemy and mysticism, biblical mysticism. But the important point is it's a reflection of a choice that we make in our attitude to people. So we want to recognize something, we want to make salient for ourselves and in our discussion of the past and of contributions made in the past, what we think about that contribution. And so we use this label, perhaps we overuse it and spread it around a bit too much. It's certainly something that we're a little over-generous with now, I agree. People used to think that it denoted extremely high intelligence, a kind of brilliance that is intellectual brilliance, which is preternatural in its character. But of course, we know, if we look at all the different people whom we call geniuses, that really it is a mixture really of one kind of sparky intelligence, one kind of luck, one kind of persistence.
I think you're absolutely right. Genius is a term that's changed quite notably over the last few centuries. And someone once said that Isaac Newton possessed a genius. He wasn't a genius, but he possessed a genius for mathematics and, more surprisingly, for making microscope lenses. So that was Isaac Newton's genius at the
Well,
time.
it's a very interesting point, that, of course, because genius, the word, used to denote a sort of spirit who sat on your shoulder.
Sat on your shoulder.
That's right, and whispered into your ear. And it's actually Romanticism which has changed this, because the Romantics said, "I am the genius. Genius is me. It's internal to me." And there's a wonderful 2 or 3 opening lines of a poem by Swinburne called Hartha, which really encapsulates this. And the lines go, "I am that which began. Out of me the years roll. Out of me, God and man." And that's a wonderful sense of the absolute ownership as a point of origin of novelty, innovation, something new and a new insight.
So we're supposedly we're in the Science Museum. We're all pretending we're in the Science Museum, even though we're just looking at each other on a screen. And in a couple of months, there's going to be a new exhibition that's going to open at the Science Museum on ancient Greek science. And so, as I'm sure you're aware, that many historians of ideas, like yourself, attach great significance to the establishment of Greek philosophy from around about the 6th century BCE. And what would you say to them? What would you say to those classicists who insist that that period of ancient Greece was the really crucial one when the modern mind was born? Why would you say it's the 17th century and not that time long ago?
Well, I would agree with them in imputing very great importance to that period. Indeed, all those thinkers we label the pre-Socratic philosophers, those from Thales, Anaximenes, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and others, who were themselves described by Aristotle as physicists, the physikoi, because their interest was in the natural world, the universe, its origin and its constitution. And they made very, very interesting, sometimes very insightful remarks about it and wrote about it. Alas, what remains of their writings is now very scanty and fragmentary, but we can see that there was what we would now call a good deal of genius about in that period and a lot of insight. It lacked, of course, the cultural setting where the science could really advance. It looks as though when we look back across the landscape of the development of scientific thinking, that there has to be a sort of critical mass of things, like, for example, agreed weights, measures, ways of calibrating things. There needs to be instrumentation that can potentiate the reach of our 5 senses. There also needs to be a kind of an arena of discussion or debate where ideas can be passed on. Now, to some extent, that was true of antiquity, yes, but it was rather very, very few people were engaged in this. That there was insufficient in the way of a framework of a kind of social structure for it. And also, of course, by the time of the late Hellenic period and the Roman period and the rise of Neoplatonism, and then, of course, after the end of the 4th century, the power of the church in the Roman Empire, that period of development and of thinking, the sort of nascence of science, was really brought to an end, which is why in the Renaissance, 15th, 16th, and 17th century, some of the works of classical antiquity which had survived and which had started to come off the printing presses once they'd been investigated, they were the very latest scientific work. They're more than 1,000 years old, but they were the very latest treatises on anatomy, or the very latest treatises on cosmology or on mathematics. And some of them remain so right up into living memory, like Euclid, for example, was a textbook in our schools in the 20th century. So you can see how for something like 1,000 years under the hegemony exercised over thought by the church, what had started to emerge in antiquity and the Hellenic period was intermitted, and then a resumption in the Renaissance and the period that we're talking about now.
Thank you. While you were answering that question, you did briefly mention instruments. And again, because we are supposedly in the Science Museum, and this talk is associated with a wonderful exhibition, Science in the City, which I really recommend to everybody if they haven't already seen it, now that the gallery is open again. And I wondered if you would talk a bit about how important all these new scientific instruments were in the development of the new theories and the new understanding of the world around us. I mean, I suppose I probably place greater emphasis on them than you do because I'm not a historian of ideas, but you acknowledge them, their importance in your book, and you've talked about them several times this evening. So I wonder if you could just sort of amplify a bit on how important instruments were.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think of the very first importance, not least because people know about the telescope, they know about Galileo, they know the trick that he played on the Senate of Venice, and made a bit of money out of them by
Perhaps you
claiming.
could explain that, the trick that he played on the Senate.
Oh well,
I think perhaps not everybody's familiar with that.
well, Galileo, of course, heard about the telescope, which had been invented, sort of spyglass or distance glass, had been invented somewhere in the Netherlands. And with his skills, he ground lenses that tremendously increased the magnification power and sold this to the Senate of Venice as something that he had invented himself. And so they gave him a great prize for doing it, and thought that they bought the patent from him. And then it turned out, of course, that they hadn't, because it was already in existence. But by that time, he had escaped and gone off to Florence because he had seen the moons of Jupiter and named them after the Medicis, and they were very delighted about that too. But what all this illustrates is, well, firstly, the definitive support given to the Copernican heliocentric view of the universe, which was still in debate. I mean, it has to be remembered that those relatively few people who knew about the Copernican view in the later half of the 16th century was very scornful of it. They thought, well, it's just nonsense. I mean, if we were flying around the sun, our hair would be streaming back behind our ears and we would be buffeted by the winds of our movement. And if we were spinning around, we would all be jolly sick or would be falling off. And, it's just a lot of nonsense. Of course, the Earth isn't moving. But when Galileo looked through his telescope, looked at the moon and he looked at the nearby planets, there was definitive observational evidence for this view. And just by itself, that one example would be just enough to illustrate the great importance. Later in the century, with the development of the microscope, and especially in the work of van Leeuwenhoek, when he saw the minute parts of things and the tiny little animalcules that existed, this was extraordinary because it was like breaking through a membrane. It was like getting into a different dimension of things altogether and seeing whole realms of reality that were invisible to the naked eye. And so the potentiation provided by instruments, extending the reach of our five senses, were fantastically important. But perhaps of equal or greater importance is what, generally speaking, of course, most people don't think of, because they think of microscopes and telescopes. And this is things like balances for weighing things accurately. Things like measuring devices or having systems of measurement which were agreed among the different inquirers so that they could communicate their findings to one another and understand what it was that they were claiming. These sorts of things were very important. And indeed, in Florence, in the middle of the 17th century, an informal academy, the Accademia Cimento, published a great volume of descriptions of instruments that had been developed by members of the academy. And it was that kind of thing that really helped with the furtherance of natural inquiry.
And what would you think about the air pump? I've always thought of that as being a very, very important instrument because it involved thinking about experiment and thinking about instruments in a different kind of way, because what the air pump did was create a vacuum or near vacuum inside a globe, which of course is a completely artificial situation that doesn't occur in the natural world. So there were lots of philosophical debates about whether you can make inferences about nature from an artificial situation that doesn't actually exist. And so I've always seen that as a very significant step, and I wondered whether you agreed with that.
No, I do very much agree with that. So, observations about the vacuum and those experiments that were conducted on top of a volcano in France, the Puy de Dôme, were very significant from that point of view, because they settled disputes. Or at any rate, they didn't immediately settle disputes. They certainly fed into the disputes between those like the Cartesians, who didn't believe in the vacuum, and those who did. And those experiments, of course, were in a way reprising in a different key experiments that the ancients had done to prove the separate existence of the air, using rather similar equipment there. But you're dead right. I mean, that was very, very important. And it is analogized by an argument that Francis Bacon put forward in the Instauratio, where he said, not just observation of nature as it is in itself, but observation of what happens when carpenters and metal workers and butchers and so on vex nature. Because when they vex nature, we learn so much more about its properties and what's inside it and how it works and what changes can be wrought in it if you burn it or freeze it and so forth. Those actions, those artificial seeming endeavors where we work with nature will teach us a very great deal about it, and we can draw inferences from those artificial circumstances to the nature of nature itself. So in a rather similar way, that was a point that Bacon insisted on.
Yeah, so Bacon had that rather wonderful expression, twisting the lion's tail. But this is a summary of what you've just been saying so eloquently. So let's go back a bit to your book and to some ideas. And one of the major themes of your book is that during the 17th century, there was a shift away from older beliefs, from superstition, from magic, from religion, astrology. They all belonged to the past. And instead, there was a new rational scientific approach that was ushered in. So, as you've already very generously mentioned, I'm quite interested in Isaac Newton. And as you've mentioned yourself, he was himself very religious. He left far more manuscripts on alchemy than on any other subject. So isn't he, we regard him as a supreme rationalist. He's celebrated as one of the greatest scientists there ever was. So how can he also be an alchemist, and how does that fit into your argument?
Well, I think, Patricia, you and others have shown us that we don't actually think about Newton like that anymore as a result of your work, because these revelations about the fact that he did indeed devote much, much more time and energy to trying to work out the secrets contained in the Book of Revelations and to do alchemical researches and so on. And it is very interesting that, because when you read what he says about method in Book 3 of the Principia, you are reading the fundamental scripture of modern rational science. And it seems a million miles away from what it was he was doing with his spare time. And you could ask yourself the question, how could Newton write that? And then how could he, in the optics at the very end there, put in that stuff that came out of the Xenia aspects? But I think the answer is this. There were people, Newton himself, he had very weird religious beliefs, but he certainly had them. And there were certainly people who were perfectly orthodox in their avowals about what they believed anyway. Descartes was an example. Now, he was mad keen on getting the Jesuits to adopt his writings as their textbooks for their schools. Instead, they put them on the index of forbidden books, which is a great mark of honor, of course, because all the best stuff that ever been written is on that index. But at any rate, there were plenty of people who were orthodox in belief and who were orthopractic in the sense that they, continue to appear, at any rate, to be orthodox. But you must remember also that the 17th century was the century of the libertines of the mind. Now, the libertines of the mind were those free thinkers, some of them were deists, some of them were atheists, who were prepared to take the risk in the first half of the 17th century, at any rate, of being prosecuted, and some indeed were. Some were threatened with the death sentence, and some were even put to death. People like Cesare Vanini, for avowing non-theistic commitment to a view of the world. In the later part of the 17th century, the libertine movement had become associated with pornographers like the Earl of Rochester and so on. So there was a change there associated with the belief that if you were a free thinker about matters of science and nature, then you would reject religion, and therefore you wouldn't have any morals. So it was a silly argument, but that was the connection that was made. So we see the two strands going together. By the 18th century, many of the people who had reached the same kind of, as it might be, level of intellectual attainment or outlook that was born in the 17th century. So we think of the philosopher and the encyclopedists and others in the 18th century Enlightenment, were at most and at best deists, rather than people who were committed to religion. But by that time, it was no longer a danger. Could be, a social danger, because you might be excluded from certain circles socially if you were too open in your deism or atheism. But in the 17th century, especially in the first half, that wasn't really an option. And anyway, as we've acknowledged, some people did retain their religious beliefs. But this is because, of course, in just the same way as water is the element in which fish live, so a religious sensibility and tradition was the element in which society moved. And so it would have been a particularly dramatic and rebarbative thing to stand out, especially in the first half of the 17th century, as a non-believer. But here's the important point. At the beginning of the 17th century, the religious outlook on the world was functionally dominant. By the end of the century, it was functionally marginal. In the following sense, today, in 2021, the majority of people in the world still have some kind of religious outlook or commitment. But the world runs on computers and vaccines and aeroplanes and so on. So what I mean by functionally dominant and functionally marginal is illustrated by that contrast. And by the 17th century, the world was becoming functionally secular in its thinking, even though the great majority of people still had a religious outlook. That was the point I wanted to make.
Okay, so it's interesting at the beginning of that answer, you mentioned Newton's book, The Optics, and for people listening, what happened was that Isaac Newton put a list of 31 questions or queries at the end of Optics, in which he made all sorts of suggestions and carefully put a question mark at the end so no one could accuse him of actually holding those beliefs. And when you said that he put forward some rather zany beliefs, I imagine one of the things you were referring to was his idea that the whole of what we think of as empty space is filled with an ether, a cloud of tiny, tiny, tiny invisible particles that you can't weigh and that you can't see and that repel each other. I mean, that's what we would now think of as one of his most zany arguments. But how is it then that throughout the 19th century, very, very eminent scientists such as Maxwell and Thomson believed very firmly in this ether? And it was only when Einstein introduced the theory of relativity that the concept of an ether was overturned.
Oh, Patricia, I wouldn't nominate that as one of his zany ideas.
Oh, I'm sorry, I made a wrong assumption. I'm sorry.
Because, I mean, there was a problem. Look, it's a very interesting thing about Newton, that in the Newton of the Principia was prepared to just describe and not to hypothesize, non-fingere, he's not going to wonder how gravity can work at a distance, because there was a great debate, of course, about occult forces and so on in the 17th century. So I'm just describing this. This is a relationship between two masses, the inverse square law, and why it works that way. I mean, suggestions had been made, magnetic attraction, for example, had been one suggestion in the 17th century, but he wasn't going to hypothesize about what it was. But naturally enough, it's a puzzle. I mean, how can there be apparent action at a distance? Isn't there something which is an intermediate? And you pointed out that in your book on the development of Newton, how influenced, well, not influenced, but at any rate, how closely he read Descartes and Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, which is his book on physics, and indeed refuted it rather handsomely in the Principia. There's sort of wonderful arguments about if Descartes was right about vortices as the source of light, then you could see in the dark by running fast enough and so on. So they're very amusing rebuttals by Newton. But you see, I take it that there is a kind of shared assumption which you can treat either figuratively or literally, depending upon where you stand in the religion zone. When Galileo said that the universe is the book of God and mathematics is the language in which it is written, you could take that literally, and Newton did. And the idea that there are forces, the agencies, powers, layers of reality that might actually have secretly been, explained in the Bible. Talked about Solomon as the greatest ever scientist because he, in the structure of the temple, had laid out the principles of the universe. I mean, it's not mad of Newton to have thought in those terms. It was a kind of commonplace at the time for a certain sort of view. Now, Newton himself said that he had written the Principia in the way that he did so that sort of mere fiddlers in mathematics wouldn't bother him with their questions and things. But you can easily see how, in a way, Newton was himself a bit of a fiddler when it came to all the stuff in Kabbalah and Hermeticism, which had been around for some time. And the attraction of the idea that there was a simple shortcut to an ultimate understanding about how everything works in the universe is a very attractive one. It certainly attracted people thinking in the 16th century, and it lingered on into the 17th. It was gone by the 18th. There was nobody comparable to Newton, really, except a few really zany people.
Well, I still think he is rather a question mark in your theory. And another one is a man that you write about quite a lot, and I was surprised you didn't talk about a man called Marin Mersenne. Mm-hmm. And you talk about his importance, with which I absolutely agree, at the centre of a correspondence network extending over the Republic of Letters. And I would like to invite you to talk a bit more about the importance of that correspondence network, and also how it is that this man, you give him this wonderful phrase, you say he acted like an internet server. I thought that was a wonderful comparison, but he also happened to be a Catholic monk. So this man that you've got at the centre of your argument, also rather like Newton, to me seems to contradict your basic thesis. So I wondered if you'd like to talk a bit about that.
Well, I'm going to resist the thought that I'm contradicting my basic thesis, because I've acknowledged that there were people who retained their religious beliefs and who felt able to do so for Descartes' reasons. Now, one great contribution that Descartes made, of course, was to separate the world addressed by religious considerations and the world available for scientific investigation, by treating the world of nature as a mechanism that had been created and set going by God, and then God no longer actually needs to wind up the clock or work the cogs, but because it is a piece of clockwork and it can be understood as such. So that kind of take on things was perfectly open to Descartes, and I think Mersenne shared that view. Mersenne was very sympathetic to Descartes' physics. And so this work of separating the two realms, that these are two quite separate magisteria and they needn't conflict with one another, allowed people who did retain some kind of orthodoxy in their religious outlook to do science without appealing to the continuing intervention of the deity in the working of the world. So I'm pretty sure that Mersenne was like that too. But interestingly, and I wish somebody, and here's an invitation, Patricia, for you with your expertise, would look into this, the question of Mersenne a bit more, because there is quite a marked shift in his outlook. He began early by being very opposed to Galileo, for example, and regarded his sort of early work, the Starry Messenger work, the telescope work, as being dangerous to the truth of the church's teachings. And yet later, he was the great communicator of Galileo's ideas to the rest of Europe, as the internet server, receiving information and then dispersing it around to all the savants around Europe. He was a prime instrument in spreading Galileo's ideas. So there was a very important change in Mersenne's outlook. And I think because he was a person of serious intellect, he was persuaded by argument, he was persuaded by evidence, and he changed his view. And I'm sure that he was able to accommodate that by treating the separateness of the two magisteria in the way that I've described already. It's also the case, I should just mention too, again, talking about, water being the element for fish and a religious worldview being the element in which people were born, brought up. And Mersenne, of course, had been educated, as Descartes himself was, at the Jesuit school of La Flèche, that to join an order and become a monk was an incredibly good way of, being able to get sort of fed and housed if you were interested just in study. So, that was a reasonable option for people to take.
So let's shift tack a bit. We've got another question from the audience, and this is submitted from Indy. And Indy is asking, would Professor Grayling care to say a few words on the near domination of this topic by males? And again, I mean, the position of women in the history of science is, again, something that I'm very interested in. But I wondered if you'd address Indy's question directly.
Well, I would recommend to Indy your book, Patricia, on women in science.
I was not inviting that. I want to record. I've not paid you to say that.
but I mean that's a very valuable contribution, because not only, of course, were women denied the opportunity and silenced, through the great majority of the centuries that have passed, from having a chance even to get the education so that they could participate in these things. But even those women who did participate and contribute, and they were, significant voices, have been sort of lost to view or not even mentioned by historians of science and ideas, as if there's some kind of conspiracy that anyway they couldn't possibly be of any major interest. And indeed they were. Now, in my own book, actually, I do mention several women who were very, very striking contributors. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia was one who forced Descartes, actually, eventually to, say, well, the truth is, I don't know, with problems that he himself couldn't resolve in his own philosophy. And one of her successes, in a way, I suppose, in connection with Descartes, was that she prompted him to write his book on the passions, because they had a long correspondence over the writings of Seneca, thinking about a kind of philosophy of life, found them unsatisfactory, and she had demanded of him that he think about this, and so wrote. Now, her letters to him are very acute. I mean, she gave him a very difficult time, and he found it extremely hard to answer her questions. She was a smart cookie and rather wonderful. Now, we see Madame de Châtelet in the early 18th century was a translator of Newton and so on. So, I mean, there are very significant figures. Relatively few, well, in fact, very few, really. But this is because of the denial of opportunity. It's a tragedy when you think that half of humankind who could have made tremendous contributions had they been given the opportunity, just didn't have the opportunity. And when we talk about people like Madame Châtelet and Princess Elizabeth, we're talking about people from wealthy aristocratic backgrounds who had an opportunity. Look at Queen Elizabeth I, who knew Latin and Greek and who was educated and so on. Why didn't she think that other women, should have these same advantages? It seems a tragedy that.
Yeah, I mean, you really, it seemed to me, if you were a woman, you had to have a lot of money, and you had to have either a father or a husband, or preferably both, who didn't object to women being educated. And to fulfill those two criteria really narrowed down the field. So, I mean, you've named two of the most important women. I'd absolutely agree. At one stage in your book, you sort of, rather like your analogy with Macbeth, you talk about the 17th century as the period roughly from 1589, when Henri IV became King of France, up to the death of Queen Anne in 1714. But so that's 1589 to 1714. Now, if you add 200 years on to each of those dates, you get to 1789 to 1914, which of course are also symbolically very important, the French Revolution and the outbreak of the First World War. And it seems to me that there were many sort of shifts in worldview during that period as well. It was when evolution by natural selection was introduced. By 1914, Einstein had also introduced relativity. Quantum mechanics was on its way. Thermodynamics, the whole concept of the universe being governed by probability rather than certainty. So do you not think they dramatically altered our view of the cosmos just as much as what happened in the 17th century?
Well, I wouldn't for 1 minute wish to diminish the great significance of the developments through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And indeed, it may very, very well be that just this last 100 years or so, with the explosion of knowledge that we've had in the natural sciences, particle physics and cosmology, and in our discovery of whole millennia of history that we had forgotten about entirely until the archaeology of the 19th century, you know, the great Mesopotamian civilizations and so on. So I wouldn't for 1 minute wish to diminish that, but I see them as consequences. This great ebullition, this great flowering of discovery and progress in thought is what was released by the 17th century. So I don't see the history of ideas as being a whole series of doglegs. I see one big dogleg, and that's the 17th century. And if I were to just pick on one thing that really illustrates that, it's that little anecdote that I gave there about looking at the night sky in the year 1600 and looking at the night sky in 1700. That one thing just by itself is so dramatic a change. Look, even in the case of evolution by natural selection and the great development in natural history and biology in the 19th century, Erasmus Darwin, again, somebody you know something about, and others had already thought, well, of course, some kind of evolutionary process has been at work. They didn't understand the mechanism. They didn't know quite how it had worked. Darwin spotted this idea of natural selection, put that forward, but even he needed, or his view needed, the supplement of developments in genetics before we really understood the mechanism that was carrying this out. So, but all this seems to me to have flowed from the fact that it was possible to ask the question, where did the universe come from? Where did life come from? How is life, could life have evolved, and so on, which in 1698, in 1598, the beginning of my long 17th century, would have been literally dangerous to ask. Mm. If you had put forward a Darwinian view about the origin of life on the planet, you would have had your toes roasted at the stake, as poor old Giordano Bruno did in that very year, indeed. Or very nearly late.
So we're all pretending that physically we're at the Science Museum, but of course this event has been co-sponsored and organised by the Royal Society, which is another very important institution in London. And that was, it got its Royal Charter in 1662, right in the middle of the period you discussed. So I wondered if you'd talk a bit about the importance of the Royal Society for developing what you call the modern mind.
Well, the Royal Society of London has been a beacon in world science ever since it received its charter in 1662. It was put together in 1660 by people who had, for several decades before, constituted what had been called the Invisible College. So it was a group of people, their internet server was a man called Hartlib, based in Oxford, right from before, in fact, the Civil War. But so it was in naissance there. I mentioned earlier that Bacon had advocated that there be public sponsorship of a research institution where all the savants, all the people who were interested in these things would come together and share their findings. And that indeed is what happened with the Royal Society. Now, the Royal Society was not the first, nor was it the only such institution. Indeed, going back even into the very late 16th century, there were groupings of people, for example, in Rome, in Florence, who had got together in order to do this, to share ideas and to try to foster actually the process of inquiry. But it had been rather sporadic and rather informal in some cases, and insufficient institutional backing was given to it. When you think about the official founding of the Royal Society in 1662, given a royal charter, given public sponsorship and backing, and principal figures, people like Christopher Wren and others at that time, lending their weight, their authority to it. Well, that was followed, something like 6 years later, by the official establishment of a similar academy in France under Louis XIV. But it was then both the model and has since been the beacon for thinking about a really high quality, publicly supported beacon for scientific progress.
Well, I really enjoying talking to you, and I have a whole host of other questions I would love to discuss with you, but we're getting near the end. So I'd like to finish with a question from the audience, which takes us up to the modern period. This is a question from someone called Len. And Len says, we seem to have entered into a scenario where there is growing distrust in science, despite having more evidence and facts available virtually at our fingertips. And Len asks, are we victims of our own success? You've talked a lot about the modern mind, the development of logical scientific thought. So how are they going to help us deal with the problems that we face now and ensure that we have a better future?
Well, the question that Len asked there is a very good one. And actually, the problem that we face is very much the problem identified more than half a century ago by C.P. Snow when he talked about the two cultures and the division between people who have a good grasp of what's happening in science and of scientific method and of what we mean when we talk about the statistics of scientific findings relating, for example, to vaccine efficacy and so forth, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, people who have very little understanding of those things. The more complicated science becomes and the more intricate and the more training you need in order to be able to really appreciate what's going on. And people working in one area of science now, like biochemistry, some specialist area of biochemistry, may know nothing whatever about what's happening in particle physics or string theory or something. So, the greater the specialism, the more silos there are of specialism into which these things get sequestered. And this division between those who understand what's happening in science and those who don't gets wider and wider. And the great danger with that is that the more difficult it is to comprehend what's happening in science, the more resistant people might be to it, and the more they might cling to very quick, easy answers. Now, I sometimes say it has the merit of being true, despite also being rather tendentious, that you can explain the major doctrines and teachings of any ideology, any great political theory or religion in less than half an hour. And it takes a bit longer than that to understand physics. So you can see where the difficulty lies here. And what we therefore need is we need to think a bit about how important it is that science literacy, you don't have to be an expert in science, but to have an intelligent appreciation of the major areas of science, what goes on in them and how they work, seems to me tremendously important and should be a very central feature of our education, no matter what you're studying, no matter what field of endeavor you're entering into. Science literacy seems to me to be an essential appurtenance of being a citizen of our world today.
Well, thank you. I agree with you that science literacy is very, very important indeed. But we haven't got time for any more discussion, unfortunately, because I'd be very happy sitting talking to you all evening. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll hand you back to Alison Boyle of the Science Museum.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you both. I feel like I'm imagining you sitting in one of the London coffee houses frequented by Robert Hooke with a spirit of genius on each of your shoulders. Again, we could talk all night and listen all night, but I'm afraid we have to finish up. So thank you all of you for joining us this evening online, and we do hope to see you in the Science Museum. If you found this evening's discussion interesting, informative, and inspiring, there's plenty more events on our website. This includes the next event associated with the Science City Gallery, which I'll be with gallery curator Alex Rose and some fantastic experts looking at some of the stories attached to the incredible objects that are on display in that gallery. We'd like again to say thank you to the Royal Society, who've enabled us to bring you both this event series and the gallery itself in the Science Museum. And please do visit the Royal Society website for more information and more events from them also. So that only leaves me to say a big thank you again to our speakers, Patricia Fara and A.C. Grayling, for their time and sharing their vast knowledge with us. And to thank you all of you to watching at home. So until next time, good night.